Hello there fellow acolytes and welcome to a special Halloween edition of Switch Gems, the series where I look at a bunch of different gems for the system, including hidden gems and well-known gems. I look at eShop titles and retail titles, and I look at some cheap games and some expensive games, so hopefully there's something there for everyone. Right, let's get cracking and see if we can find some spooky games. The first game on my list is Vaccine. Vaccine is a procedurally generated survival horror game. It's very much reminiscent of something like the original Resident Evil or Silent Hill. You're walking around a building that's filled with zombies and other monsters, and your objective is to track down the vaccine. Before I go further, many people have pointed out that what you're actually looking for is a cure, not a vaccine. However, I would slightly argue against that point. The game has a surprising amount of depth to it, and the story is more than what you think it is. So I would say let the game play through, and if you manage to beat it through to the actual end, then the title does actually make a little bit of sense. The game controls pretty much as you would expect it to. You can sprint, you attack by holding down the shoulder button and then the action button. You go into an inventory and you can equip different items, or to use other items such as recovering health or stamina or whatever. How this game differs from something like Resident Evil is that the game is procedurally generated, so no two games are ever the same. The maps, the items, the enemies are all randomly generated, so even though the game isn't extremely long, it still gives you enough incentive to replay because it has that certain fresh feeling each time you play it. Normally I hate procedurally generated games because they tend to be more difficult than they should be because they rely on an awful amount of luck more than anything. This game does suffer from that to a degree. Sometimes you'll have a run where you encounter one of the stronger licker type enemies before you've even got like a proper weapon in order to deal with it. But honestly, that doesn't happen too often. And because the game sort of works on a New Game Plus type basis, where once you beat the game, you then go through again, but with slightly different criteria, and you get stronger and stronger. It's only ever a problem on your very first playthrough. Once you get through to the second loop, you have zero issues whatsoever. The game looks as you would expect. It looks just like the original Resident Evil. There's even an option to turn on CRT mode, where the graphics have the CRT filter. I like having it on for that retro feel, but if you don't, it's always an additional option and it is off by default. Some people slate this game because they say it's a bit crappy, but honestly, if you're used to old survival horror games which rely on things like tank controls, then you'll probably find a lot of fun in this. It's a very cheap game and it's something that even if you're not going to play again and again, it's still worth having a bash on every so often. I bought this last Halloween and there was a substantial sale on it, and I imagine that it'll probably be on sale again this Halloween too. If it is, I definitely recommend picking it up and trying it out, seeing what you think. Maybe you won't like it, but me, I like this game a hell of a lot, and it's one of my favourite games on the system. The next game on the list is Butcher. Butcher is sort of a 2D action platformer with very visceral action. You have lots of weapons to choose from, and there's lots of violence and blood in the game, and an awful lot of challenge. Someone once described this game as a 2D version of Doom, and honestly, I think that is the best comparison this can get. If you can imagine playing Doom on the harder settings, this basically just feels like that, apart from in 2D. The default difficulty mode is hard, but there's also a casual mode there too. I started on hard mode, and to be honest, once I got further into the game, I had to drop the difficulty down to casual mode because the game was getting pretty tough. But even on casual, as you get onto the later levels and the really difficult final boss, you can still get one hell of a challenge even on the easiest difficulty setting. This game prides itself on its difficulty and its violence, and it pulls both off extremely well. All the weapons you get are quite over the top and they feel very meaty to use. No matter what weapon you're using, it will always feel very satisfying as you tear through the enemies. The control scheme with the left trigger being jump is a little strange and takes some getting used to, but it still works kinda well. You aim using the right analog and shoot using the right trigger, so the game also has a very kind of twin stick shooter kind of feel to it as well. The whole game feels very cathartic. It's one of those games where if you feel like you need to expel some energy and some rage, then this is a perfect game to do it, much like Doom. Again, this is another very cheap game, and I actually originally picked this up last Halloween on a sale, so keep an eye on the eShop, and if you see it going for dirt cheap again, I would definitely recommend you pick it up. I didn't expect this game to be very good when I bought it, but I was pleasantly surprised. The next game on my list is Bayonetta. Bayonetta is a hack and slash game that came out a while back on the Xbox 360 and PS3. It later got an updated release on the Wii U and then eventually a port to the Switch. Not that you'd be able to tell though, because the game still looks absolutely beautiful and actually looks like a game that came out only in the last year or two. If you've ever played the Devil May Cry series, this kind of plays more or less like that. Apart from instead of controlling a cool ass dude, you control a cool ass woman. Much like Devil May Cry, this game is very much heavy on style. Everything is all done to be overly cool and over the top. Bayonetta herself looks kind of like a porn star in her sexy outfits and provocative poses, but everything's done to such an obscene degree, it's absolutely ridiculous. But that's the best word really to describe this game, ridiculous. Everything is over the top. The story itself is complete nonsense. It kind of works in its own world, where everything seems consistent with itself, but the world itself is just so fucking stupid and so over the top that it all just becomes hilarious. But the game knows this. There's one scene where Bayonetta shoots a statue of a baby right in the dick in order to make it explode. There's another sequence where you're on a motorbike, cutting through lots of traffic and sliding under closing doors and going over ramps. The whole game is just ridiculously over the top. The boss fights too were kind of stupid. You fight these bizarre bosses, but therein lies the charm. Not only does the game have a ridiculous charm to it as well, but the game is actually really good. The controls are very tight, and the gameplay mechanics, which largely focus around witch time and dodging, are all extremely well done and extremely responsive, that you'll never feel like anything's your fault. And once you finally get your head around the mechanics, you'll find it's a very rewarding system indeed. When I started playing this game, I didn't expect it to be as good as it was, and I was pleasantly surprised. So much so that I'm actually quite looking forward to playing Bayonetta 2 and Bayonetta 3 afterwards. This game is definitely a recommendation, especially if you like the hack and slash genre. In fact, this game was very close to being my pick of the video, but that game was beaten to the top spot by something that I enjoy slightly more. So yeah, Bayonetta, it's a damn good game. Buy it. The next game on the list is the Countlukanov. The Countlukanov is quite a strange game. It feels sort of like an 8-bit walking simulator to an extent, but the game does have a strong emphasis on both horror and puzzle elements. It's a very unique title where you control Hans, who's a poor little boy who's looking to find his fortune, as he enters into the castle of Countlukanov. He is met by a strange blue fella who says that if he can find out what his name is, then he will be granted the title of the new Countlukanov. The boy, who sees this as a great opportunity, sets off to find out the dude's name and win the fortune. Early on, the game establishes itself as a horror title. As soon as you leave the village, you'll find some very strange goings on. For example, your mother gives you a walking stick, and the first person you meet is an old lady who's having trouble walking. You can choose to give her the walking stick, and if you do give her the stick, she then uses the stick to beat 7 bells of shit out of her pig. It's quite jarring how unsettling this is quite early on in the game, and things only get crazier from there. You have demonic goats, limbless corpses, and copious amounts of blood. As the game progresses and goes into its puzzle style, the puzzles are all quite enjoyable, although none are particularly difficult. The difficulty lies with the servants of the house. The servants of the house are demonic and will kill you on sight. Because everything is so dark in the game, you have to manage the use of candles, both carrying one and putting them down, and also a very limited save system, which adds the additional stress and makes this more of a horror experience. The game's story is very well told, and all the way through to the ending it keeps up the charm and the pace of the story, and the ending as well is also pretty cool, with multiple endings to give you incentive to explore further and try again. Aside from the game's length, which isn't particularly long, the only real issue is the walking speed of Hans. He does move quite slowly, but by the time you actually get into the castle, you get used to the walking speed and it doesn't become a problem. The design of the castle in particular is quite compact, so you never feel that you're walking long spaces with nothing happening. All in all though, it's a very quirky horror title and the atmosphere is fantastic and definitely worth picking up. However, because the price is a little steep at €15, maybe wait for a Halloween sale to see if you can get it for under a tenner. And the final game on our list is Resident Evil Revelations. Resident Evil Revelations is a Capcom survival horror game in the long-running franchise. It was originally released on the 3DS, and I believe it was released around the same time as Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 6 has a bit of a reputation for being a little bit shit, and before that we had Resident Evil 5, which, even though it wasn't a bad game, it was predominantly an action game with very little horror elements. Resident Evil Revelations, however, seemed to go back to the series' roots, focusing on one central location and trying to incorporate horror into it. We've been in various different mansions throughout the series, we've been in trains, we've been in police stations. This time we're on a ship, the Queen Zenobia. Whilst the game predominantly takes place on the ship, there are also some other cutaway sections. Not only do you play as Jill, but you can also play as Chris. Chris starts off in an Arctic area, but eventually finds his way onto the ship. There's also two other idiots you play as, Keith and Quint, and they're mostly again in Arctic locations. But to be honest, those two are kind of where the game falls a little bit flat. Those two characters are supposed to be the comic relief, and they just come across as quite annoying. However, thankfully their levels are a very tiny part of the game, so it doesn't spoil anything. Playing as both Jill and Chris though is thankfully an enjoyable experience throughout, and the plot itself is as ridiculous as you would expect from a Resident Evil game, but is also enjoyable for exactly the same reasons. Whilst the game started as a 3DS title, it later got ported to home consoles, and has eventually found its way to the Switch. The game looked beautiful on the 3DS when it originally came out, and I'm pleased to say it still looks just as good, and it plays just as well. The character models and the locations all look fantastic. However, I will say that the design of the monsters don't quite look as good as the rest of the game. Personally, I find that these kind of fishy zombie creatures look a little bit low res in terms of their textures. It would have been nice if the console ports had a completely revamped look for the enemies, but they didn't. They don't look terrible, and they're certainly enjoyable enough to fight, but aesthetically I think they're probably the weaker part of the game. In addition to the fantastic single player campaign, you also have a raid mode option. Raid mode is a bonus game which replaces the traditional mercenaries mode in Resident Evil games. In this mode you have mini maps from the main game with a variety of different enemies. The enemies are all kind of randomised. You might get some that are bigger, some might get some that are stronger, you might get some that are just faster. Use different weapons at your disposal to try and earn points, and then you can use those points to get better weapons or upgrades for your weapons. It's a very arcade style game mode, and it's really enjoyable. The game itself is €20, which honestly for the length of the game and the quality of the game is absolutely worth it. This game doesn't feel anywhere near as clunky as the older Resident Evil games, so I would even say that this title is actually suitable for people who aren't normally fans of the genre, and it's just a damn good time. As fun as Bayonetta is, which I covered earlier, and trust me, that is a damn good game, for me I think that Resident Evil Revelation just edges it out to become the better game and earn my solid recommendation. So those are the 5 games that we covered this time. We had Vaccine, Butcher, Bayonetta, the Countlukanov, and Resident Evil Revelations. 5 amazing Halloween titles there for the Switch. Have you played any of them? If so, drop me a comment below and let me know what you think. If not, then I'm sure there's a Halloween sale going on at this very moment, so go and pick them up. Thanks all for watching. Until next time, bye.